What would you do if the person who took your parents' lives was now using their inheritance, hundreds of millions of dollars, to hire elite lawyers and escape justice? Brentwood 2025. A stunning mansion becomes the scene of an unforgivable massacre. Nick Reiner, once a Hollywood heir, now stands accused as a cold-blooded killer. But this is not just a murder case. It is a tragedy of betrayal. Drop 1 if you feel outraged. Drop 0 if you believe the truth is still being buried. Don't look away, the darkness is only beginning to surface. Every tragedy carries within it the seeds planted long before, as people began retracing memories of what once seemed like a joyful Christmas evening. Where early signs of psychological instability in the son, Nick first emerged, revealing a fragile mental state in which the boundary between reason and the darker corners of consciousness gradually became dangerously thin, and instead of remorse, the aftermath of his rage manifested as an unsettling coldness as the young man walked away from the scene, carrying unresolved secrets, seeking refuge in a temporary hiding place, and using whatever resources remained to secure a legal shield from top defense attorneys. The contrast between the pain of those left behind and the chilling calm of the perpetrator forces everyone to ask, what could have stripped a human being of conscience? And according to official records, darkness fell over the house during the fragile transition between the old day and the new, requiring no forced entry because the once familiar intruder already possessed the key to the heart of the home. And in the stillness of the night, a series of uncontrolled actions unfolded, transforming the safety of a bedroom into the scene of a permanent and irreversible farewell. The escape that followed became a series of silent movements. And at 4 a.m. in Santa Monica, inside a modest room, Nick existed like a ghost, disconnected, unrested, and submerged in the chaos of his own mind, while the truth only fully surfaced when the sunlight of the new day began to fade, marked by a missed appointment, an unopened door, and the shock of family members confronted with a horrific scene as the sound of alarms rang out and authorities began a race against time to reconstruct the final moments. From fragmented surveillance footage at a gas station, the portrait of a man on the brink of collapse gradually came into focus, exhausted, gaunt, and consumed by anxiety until the silence of handcuffs finally ended the escape opening. Instead, a deeply painful chapter of psychological and moral reckoning, as the case proved to be not merely a collection of timestamps or body temperature readings in forensic reports, but a stark warning about the vital importance of mental health and family connection, and a reminder that even the most ordinary household objects can become instruments of tragedy when human self-control is lost. We revisit this story not to exploit pain, but to better understand the hidden corners of the human psyche, and learn how to protect and empathize with one another before it is too late. Because in the world of criminology, the places we feel safest can sometimes be the most vulnerable, and in Brentwood, familiarity did not offer protection, but instead became a ruthless advantage, as the perpetrator needed to break no physical barriers, because he already held the key to trust. And what occurred inside that bedroom was not merely an impulsive act, but a brutal invasion of the most private human space at a moment when its occupants were at their least defensible. From the perspective of forensic experts, such as Professor Joseph Scott Morgan, every trace left at a crime scene serves as a silent confession by the perpetrator, and the infliction of deep repeated injuries to vital areas is not merely an act of taking a life, but a reflection of an extreme psychological state in which rage has overwhelmed all moral boundaries as forensic reality. Unlike the swift portrayals seen on screen, reveals a process driven by the imposition of power and absolute control, where the choice of close-range methods indicates direct cold contact requiring physical endurance and a mind that has become completely detached from ordinary human empathy. In professional circles, the term overkill is used to describe an attack that goes far beyond any functional purpose, implying an intense hatred or a deeply suppressed internal conflict, and investigators reconstructed an eerily silent scene before the storm broke, where if the victims were indeed attacked while asleep, it demonstrates that the perpetrator knew every breath and every daily habit, a familiarity that transformed a son, a family member, into a calculating and predatory ghost. The evidence of severe damage to the circulatory system at the scene points to undeniable brutality, where life slowly faded under the control of someone who had once been deeply loved. Yet perhaps what troubles the public most is not only what occurred on that fateful night, but what followed afterward, a cruel irony in which Nick Reiner, the man accused of ending his parents' lives, now uses their very legacy, the product of their lifetime of work, to construct a legal fortress for himself. The decision to hire Alan Jackson, one of the towering figures in American criminal defense law, raises profound questions about ethics and justice, as a young man who had lived dependently without an independent career now uses the very financial resources of the deceased to seek his own freedom, creating a bitter cycle that forces the public to ask whether justice itself can be bought with what remains of a tragedy. And the story of the Reiner family is not merely a dry case file, but a costly lesson about fractures within modern relationships and the critical importance of recognizing psychological instability before it escalates into irreversible action. As the legal spotlight illuminates the darkest corners of this case, we see not only the downfall of an individual, but also a warning about the fragility of family values when confronted with inner darkness. And in the judicial world, numbers often speak to the complexity of a case, because when the name Alan Jackson is mentioned, it signifies not merely a lawyer, but the most formidable legal shield with enormous costs, typically reserved for major legal battles, now mobilized to encase a personal collapse. But the shock does not lie in the numbers themselves. It lies in their origin, as a harsh truth has been circulating, that the lifetime fortune accumulated by Rob and Michele Reiner, estimated at hundreds of millions of US dollars, is now being used to defend the very person accused of ending their lives, a decision rooted in painful humanity, by the surviving family members who did not choose the harshest form of punishment, but instead pursued understanding through psychiatry, hoping that rather than a permanent sentence behind bars, rigorous medical treatment might offer a more humane answer, one that in the depths of forgiveness, the departed themselves might have quietly accepted with a smile. From a legal standpoint, this is a deeply complex dilemma, as California law imposes strict rules on inheritance for individuals implicated in family-related criminal cases. Yet before the light of justice delivers its final judgment, these financial resources remain in a gray zone that allows legal support to continue, creating a struggle between fiduciary responsibility and a person's right to legal defense. And December 18, 2025, marked a critical milestone with Nick Reiner's first appearance before the court, where, dressed in subdued blue tones symbolizing remorse and discipline, the image became a stark emblem of a complete collapse from the heights of privilege and recognition into the depths of isolation. The courtroom was gripped by a suffocating silence. Before the judge, there was only a deadly stillness. No explanations, no emotions, just Nick. This delay until 2026 isn't just about time. It's the calm before an unprecedented legal storm. Who is Nick really? A cold-blooded mastermind or a pathetic pawn? Drop a 2 in the comments if you think he's dangerously mysterious. Drop a 5 if you think this is all just a cheap act. Smash that like button and subscribe now. We'll be decoding the shocking truth in our upcoming videos. To understand the present, we must step back into the past and examine wounds that never truly healed, as Nick Reiner, born into a family of cinematic legends, was forced from an early age to carry the crushing weight of expectation and overwhelming fame cast by his father Rob and his grandfather Carl Reiner. Yet behind the spotlight lay a far darker reality, because from the age of 15, Nick fell into a spiral of the most powerful addictive substances, poisons, that not only ravaged the body, but eroded willpower and emotional control, and this battle against dependency stretched across decades, transforming a once promising teenager into a profoundly lost soul. The incident at Conan O'Brien's party was not a coincidence, but the culmination of a long accumulation of psychological instability, as Nick Reiner never truly felt that he belonged to the red carpets or the dazzling lights of Hollywood. And behind the label of a showbiz heir, a quiet tragedy had begun very early, with his parents, Rob and Michele, facing every parent's worst nightmare when they were forced to place their son in rehabilitation while he was still a minor. An intervention that was not a beginning, but the start of a brutal cycle marked by 18 hospitalizations within just a few short years. Nick lived in a cycle of temporary sobriety, a suspended state just stable enough to allow him to return home before sinking once more into the darkness of hallucinations. And Rob Reiner, speaking from a father's heart, once declared, "Being a parent means never giving up," having given his son everything from financial support and career opportunities to shelter under the Brentwood roof. Yet that immense love sometimes became a tragedy with no clear answer, and when every gentle effort failed, the Reiner family was forced to resort to tough love, a necessary but deeply painful line of discipline. In response, Nick chose to abandon safety and plunge into years of homelessness, drifting from state to state, from Maine to Texas, a period he later described as ground zero of existence, where death brushed past him repeatedly amid dangerous street relationships and the domination of toxic substances. And although the 2015 film Project, Being Charlie, was once hoped to serve as a bridge of reconciliation, a chance for father and son to reflect together on shared pain, that hope proved painfully fragile. In 2018, an overdose incident on an airplane brought Nick perilously close to the boundary of permanence, as his psychological instability escalated to the point that he destroyed the very place that had sheltered him, forcing his parents to make a painful decision to place him under direct supervision in the Maine Brentwood home, starting in 2020 as a final attempt to keep their son from falling into the abyss. And now, after the tragedy has unfolded, the central question remains whether the darkness of the past can be transformed into a shield for the future, a dilemma that leaves attorney Alan Jackson facing one of the most difficult legal puzzles of his career. Witnesses in Santa Monica described Nick Reiner as being in a state of disconnection from reality immediately after the incident. Yet in the language of the law, the boundary between a mind poisoned by substance abuse and one deemed legally insane is exceedingly thin, raising the question of whether addiction constitutes a mitigating factor or evidence of deliberate self-destruction. A distinction that will become the true battlefield between Alan Jackson and the district attorney's office, as the public wonders whether the reputation of a top defense attorney can alter the trajectory of a case where the evidence appears overwhelming, because the upcoming trial will not merely determine the fate of one individual, but will also expose the fault lines within the criminal justice system and the framework of mental health care. Within California's legal labyrinth, the use of intoxicating substances is often a double-edged sword, because while some argue that a chemically altered mental state can blur intent, the law demands ironclad proof of complete incapacity to act. And in Nick Reiner's case, the possession of a weapon and the sequence of events following a verbal confrontation sketch a pathway of preparation where the distinction between a momentary outburst of rage and a premeditated act becomes the key that unlocks the door to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. When lethal injuries are inflicted with precision, arguments of accident or random loss of control become exceedingly fragile under the scrutiny of forensic medicine, and this case is already being compared by observers to a new chapter in classic Hollywood crime sagas, evoking names such as O.J. Simpson or the Menendez brothers, while the presence of cultural icons as witnesses, figures like Conan O'Brien or Larry David, threatens to turn the courtroom into a prism through which the entire lifestyle and underlying fractures of the elite class will be exposed. Prosecutor Nathan Hawkman holds the decisive cards in his hands, ranging from DNA and bloodstain evidence to digital data extracted from the mansion's modern security systems. While facing him is Alan Jackson, a master of defense strategy who must find a way to humanize a figure already branded by public bias as someone who lived off reflected glory. And to understand why the tragedy unfolded, we must return to the evening of December 13th, 2025, when inside Conan O'Brien's brightly lit home, amid laughter and celebratory holiday wine, a quiet tension hung over the Reiner family. Bringing Nick along was not an impulsive decision by Rob and Michele, but a desperate attempt to protect their son from himself, driven by the fear that the silence of an empty house would become a refuge for Nick's psychological demons. Yet, in a cruel irony, that very shelter only tightened the suffocating pressure as the parents' anxious glances and the son's instability, expressed in every gesture, combined to create an extreme psychological buildup, one that ultimately erupted into a seismic rupture that erased all traces of love and safety. Nick Reiner stands at a crossroads with extreme wealth on one side and the abyss of emptiness on the other. And this story is not merely a criminal case, but a mirror reflecting the deadlock of modern families in their struggle to connect with lost souls, raising the question of whether a jury of ordinary citizens can empathize with someone who grew up in privilege yet chose a path of self-destruction, or whether they will deliver the harshest possible verdict to account for the pain of those who are gone, as justice prepares to offer its answer in the historic trial ahead. The worn gray hoodie and the hood pulled tightly over his head were not merely clothing, but a wall, separating him from the glamorous world around him. And Nick's presence that night felt like a discordant note, as his repeated questions about identity and fame were not just odd behavior, but the expression of a soul adrift, a desperate inquiry into existence within an environment to which he had never truly belonged. And when iconic figures such as Jane Fonda or Bill Hader sensed the electric current of unease in the room, it marked the moment when the boundary of collective calm began to fracture. The smoldering storm finally erupted in the heart of the party, and the image of Rob Reiner, the father, who had long persisted in protecting his son, pulling Nick into a hallway corner, became a symbol of one last desperate effort, as the reproaches and raised voices did not stem from hatred, but from the overwhelming helplessness of a parent watching the child he loved most slowly dissolve into the darkness of psychological instability, while Michele, the woman who had always tried to serve as a bridge between strictness and compassion, stood there in utter despair. The moment they left, abandoning Nick amid an atmosphere thick with hostility, stands as one of the most heartbreaking images of the case, because their backward glance was not an act of abandonment, but a promise of unconditional love. A promise that, in cruel irony, became the last one they would ever give their son while still alive. And the tragedy in Brentwood is not merely a criminal case, but a tragic ballad of love failing in the face of mental illness and addiction, as the entire lives of Rob and Michele Reiner were defined by a long journey of sacrifice, patience, and forgiveness. But in the end, they paid with their own lives for that fragile hope of their son's redemption, leaving behind not only the question of why, but of how we can recognize and stop inner storms before they erase everything. whether there is a limit to parental forgiveness, and whether their efforts were truly in vain, perhaps not because their story has become a wake-up call for millions of other families about the critical importance of timely and realistic psychological intervention. The Reiner family tragedy will remain etched in the public memory as a painful reminder of the fragility of happiness, and we extend our deepest condolences to those who remain. Thank you for accompanying us on this journey to uncover the truth behind the hidden corners of this case. Please share your thoughts on the most important lesson. This story leaves us. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our in-depth analyses of the world's most shocking cases, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next documentary chapter.